There is a particular kind of laughter that stays with a person. Not the warm kind. Not the involuntary kind that spills out of people at something genuinely funny. The other kind. The kind that is shaped like a dismissal and delivered like a verdict. Eleanor Marsh had heard that laughter on the morning her father's will was read, standing in a beige-carpeted room in a law office in Beaufort, South Carolina, with her divorce still fresh enough that the papers were barely dry, standing in the specific way of someone who has been diminished so many times in recent months that she has learned to take up less space as a form of self-protection. She had heard it from her ex-husband's mother, Constance, who was seated across the table with the posture of a woman who has always believed that rooms belong to her. She had heard it from Constance's son, Douglas, who was her ex-husband and who sat beside his mother with the slightly sheepish look of a man who is embarrassed by his mother's laugh, but not embarrassed enough to ask her to stop. She had heard it from Douglas's sister, Patrice, who had never liked Eleanor and had spent the 11 months of the divorce proceedings making this dislike felt in every way that stopped just short of requiring a lawyer's formal response. What they were laughing at was a fishing cabin. Her father, Harold Gaines, had left Eleanor 3 things in his will: a box of photographs, a Bible with a ribbon bookmark still at the Book of Ruth, which had been his favorite and which Eleanor had always understood as its own kind of message, and the deed to a fishing cabin on Leland Lake in the low country of South Carolina, 2 hours from Beaufort, on a dirt road that the county maps showed, but that Eleanor had visited only twice in her childhood, both times before she was 10 years old. The photographs she could understand. The Bible she could understand completely. The cabin she had not expected, and when the lawyer had read the address aloud, there had been a silence in the room, and then Constance had made a sound in the back of her throat, and then Douglas had pressed his lips together in the way he did when he was trying not to smile and failing, and then Patrice had simply laughed, openly, the full version, not troubling herself to contain it. Eleanor had looked at the deed in the lawyer's hands. She had not looked at any of them. The thing about the laughter was not that it hurt in the way that cruelty hurts. Eleanor was 68 years old and had been married to Douglas Hartwell for 31 years, and had in the course of those 31 years developed a considerable tolerance for the specific calibration of contempt that his family specialized in. The thing about the laughter was what it assumed. It assumed that a fishing cabin on a dirt road in the low country of South Carolina was the worst possible inheritance. It assumed that what could not be sold quickly for a significant amount had no value. It assumed that Eleanor Gaines, who had been Eleanor Hartwell for 31 years and who was now, in the aftermath of the divorce, Eleanor Marsh, the name she had taken from her grandmother, the name she had returned to as an act of recovery, would be diminished by what her father had left her. What the laughter did not account for was Eleanor herself, or her father, or the fact that Harold Gaines had been a man who understood what things were worth in ways that had nothing to do with the price they would bring at auction. She had met Raymond Marsh at the public library in Beaufort 14 months after the divorce was finalized. She had been there on a Tuesday afternoon in the specific way that people who are rebuilding their lives go to libraries, for the silence, for the order of it, for the reliable comfort of a place that holds things carefully and makes them available without judgment. Raymond had been at the reference desk asking the librarian about a particular fishing manual published in 1947 that he had been trying to locate for 3 years. Eleanor had heard him describe it, standing at the shelf nearby, and had said without entirely deciding to say it, that her father had owned a copy of that book, that she had seen it in his cabin when she was a girl, that she was fairly certain it was still there. Raymond had turned and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just received unexpected and excellent news, and who is also, in the same moment, looking at someone he would like to know better. They had had coffee that afternoon at the small place on Bay Street. They had talked for 3 hours. Raymond was 71, a retired marine biologist who had spent his career studying the estuarine ecosystems of the South Carolina coast, a man of the specific type who has devoted his working life to understanding things that most people overlook and who brings that quality of attention to everything he encounters. He had been widowed 4 years before. He had a daughter in Charleston and a son in Georgia, and he told Eleanor with the directness of someone who has decided that time is too limited for circumlocution, been lonely in a way that he had not known how to address. Eleanor had recognized that kind of loneliness. She had been living in it for nearly 2 years. They had been married 11 months later, quietly, at the county courthouse with Raymond's daughter and Eleanor's oldest friend as witnesses, and they had moved into Raymond's house in Beaufort, a comfortable craftsman bungalow 2 blocks from the water, and they had begun the specific project of building a life together that both of them understood was different from the lives they had built before, smaller in some ways, more deliberate, more conscious of what it was. Eleanor had kept the cabin. She had not yet been back to it since the will reading. She had kept it the way you keep something you are not ready to face, in the back of your awareness, present but set aside, waiting for the moment when you would have the resources to approach it honestly. The resources were not financial, though those had been scarce enough in the first year after the divorce. The resources were internal, the particular kind of steadiness that comes from having rebuilt enough of yourself that you can stand in a difficult place without being undone by it. The divorce had been, in the language that lawyers use, a contested dissolution. In the language that Eleanor used when she let herself be honest about it, it had been a methodical stripping. Douglas Hartwell had not been a cruel man in the theatrical sense. He had not raised his voice or broken things or behaved in the ways that courts respond to visibly. He had been something more effective than that. He had been patient and organized and had understood, from the beginning of the proceedings, that the goal was to arrive at the smallest possible settlement while appearing entirely reasonable throughout. He had helped. Constance had recommended the lawyer. Patrice, who was a real estate agent, had provided valuations of the marital property that had been, as Eleanor's own lawyer had noted in the flat language of professional understatement, difficult to reconcile with comparable market data. The house in Beaufort, where Eleanor and Douglas had lived for 19 years, had been valued at a figure that allowed Douglas to buy out her share for an amount that did not allow Eleanor to acquire anything comparable. The investment accounts, which had been built over 3 decades of Eleanor's work as a pediatric occupational therapist, had been divided according to a formula that her lawyer had challenged and that the mediator had upheld with modifications that were better than nothing and not as good as fair. She had come out of it with her car, her personal belongings, a portion of the retirement account, and the fishing cabin that everyone laughed at. She had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Beaufort. She had gone back to work, part-time at first, and then full-time when the finances required it, working with children at the county rehabilitation center 3 days a week. She had sat with her grief, because what a divorce of 31 years produces is grief, the same architecture as other grief, the absence of a future you had assumed, the renegotiation of everything you thought you knew about who you were. She had, slowly, begun to be all right. Raymond was the largest part of that. Not because he had rescued her. Eleanor was not a woman who required rescuing and would have recognized and refused the dynamic if it had presented itself. But because he was genuinely interested in her, the specific and complete version of her that included the divorce and the cabin and the year in the apartment and the work with children and the grandmother's name she had taken back. He was interested in all of it without requiring any of it to be different than it was. This was, Eleanor had come to understand, one of the rarest things one person can offer another. It was Raymond who had suggested, in the spring of their 2nd year of marriage, that they go to the cabin. He had not framed it as a suggestion about the cabin specifically. He had framed it as a suggestion about the spring, about the low country in April, about the particular quality of the light on the inland waterways at that time of year, which he described with the precise affection of a man who has studied those waterways scientifically and loves them separately from the science. He had talked about the estuarine ecosystem of the lake region, about the specific birds that would be there in April, about the fishing, about the particular pleasure of being somewhere without a schedule. Eleanor had heard all of this and had known what he was actually offering, which was company for something she needed to do and had been avoiding, and she had said yes. They drove out on a Friday morning in April, Eleanor's car packed with enough supplies for a week, taking the highway south from Beaufort, and then the county road east, and then the long dirt road that the GPS lost track of 2 miles before it arrived at the lake. The country changed as they drove. The familiar architecture of coastal South Carolina, the live oaks and the palmetto and the Spanish moss hanging in the long-armed trees, became something quieter and more interior, the scrub pine thickening, the road narrowing, the sense of the ordinary world receding behind them in the specific way it recedes when you have gone far enough from it that it stops being the reference point. Eleanor had not been here since she was 9 years old. She was aware of this with the particular awareness of someone who is about to encounter a place that belongs to an earlier version of themselves. She was 68 years old, and she was going back to a fishing cabin she had visited twice in childhood, and she did not know what she would find there or what she would feel when she found it. What she felt, when the dirt road ended in the small clearing at the lake's edge and the cabin came into view through the pine trees, was something she had not anticipated. Not grief, not the complicated emotion of loss revisited. Something quieter. Something that had the texture of recognition. The cabin was small. She remembered it as larger, which was the way childhood scales work, everything proportioned to a body that has not yet grown to its full size. It was a single-story structure of board and batten construction, painted once in a dark green that had faded to the particular color of old wood that has given up pretending to be anything other than what weather has made it. A covered porch ran the full length of the front, its boards warped but present, looking out over the lake through a screen of pine and cypress and the low scrub vegetation of the water's edge. The lake itself was there beyond the cabin, flat and dark and still in the April morning. The kind of inland lake that the low country produces, brackish, full of the specific life that brackish water supports, the cypress knees rising from the shallows, the lily pads beginning their spring coverage of the surface, the particular smell of water that has been still long enough to develop its own chemistry. Raymond had gotten out of the car and stood looking at the lake with the expression of a man in the presence of something he respects. He had his binoculars around his neck, and he raised them without comment and stood for a moment, tracking something in the tree line across the water. "Wood stork," he said. Eleanor was looking at the cabin. Her father had loved this place. She understood that now in a way she had not when she was 9 years old, and the cabin had been simply the place they went sometimes in summer, a place without television or reliable electricity, where her father got up before dawn to fish and came back smelling of the lake and whatever had happened out there in the early morning that he never fully described but always seemed to have needed. She understood now that this had been his place in the way that certain places become extensions of a person, places where they are most themselves, where the self that daily life requires them to manage can set down its management and simply be. Harold Gaines had been a quiet man, quiet in the way that certain men of his generation were quiet, not cold, not absent, but economical with the parts of themselves that they considered private. He had been a commercial fisherman for 20 years, and then had worked at the marine supply store in Beaufort for another 15 years until his retirement. And he had been throughout these decades a man who knew the water, who knew the specific ecology and the specific equipment and the specific traditions of the fishing culture of the South Carolina Low Country, and who had kept this knowledge mostly to himself except in the company of other men who shared it. Eleanor had been his only child. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 30, and Harold had managed this loss with the same quiet economy with which he managed everything, not visibly diminished, but somehow settled further into himself, more interior, more given to the silences that Eleanor had always recognized as his way of being present. He had left her the cabin because he wanted her to have something that was his in the deepest sense, something that the divorce and Constance's laughter and the mediator's formula could not touch or value or divide. Eleanor understood this now, standing in the clearing in April with Raymond looking at the wood stork and the lake doing what the lake had always done, which was nothing and everything simultaneously. She walked up the porch steps. The key was on the ring that the lawyer had given her with the deed, an old key, substantial, the kind that communicates in its weight the seriousness of what it locks. She put it in the lock. It turned with the resistance of metal that has not been asked to move in a long time, and the door opened. Inside was the smell of her father. She had not expected that. Not literally his smell, not the particular combination of lake water and machine oil and the pipe tobacco he had given up in his 70s, but whose residue had never fully left his clothes. But something that carried those things as memory carries them, the way a place that has been closed against the weather holds in itself the last version of its occupant's presence. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and Raymond, who had followed her up the steps, put his hand briefly on her shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly right. The main room was one large space, living area and kitchen combined, with a wood stove against the north wall and a pine table and 4 chairs in the center and a worn sofa against the south wall facing the window that looked out over the lake. The furniture had the particular quality of things chosen for use rather than appearance, solid and plain and entirely adequate to their purpose. On the shelves beside the wood stove were her father's things, arranged with the neatness of a man who knew where everything was and kept it there because he might need to find it quickly in the dark. His tackle boxes, his reels, 3 of them, hung on hooks. A coffee can full of something she could not yet identify. The fishing manual that Raymond had been looking for at the library in Beaufort, its spine cracked from years of use, its cover worn to a uniform brown. Raymond had seen the manual from the doorway and had made a sound she had not heard from him before, something between a professional recognition and a personal one. She walked through the room, touching things as she went. The back of a chair, the edge of the shelf, the handle of the coffee can, which turned out to be full of hand-tied flies, her father's work, each one a small precise construction of feathers and thread and hook, each one representing an hour of winter evenings at the kitchen table in Beaufort with the magnifying glass and the thread winder and the box of materials he ordered from a shop in Vermont. She had forgotten that he tied his own flies. She had sat at that same kitchen table as a girl and watched him do it, watched the slow, precise work of his hands, and had found it incomprehensible that so much effort went into something so small. She understood it now. She understood a great many things about her father now that had required the passage of decades and a specific kind of loss to become clear. There was a door at the back of the main room that led to the single bedroom. Another door beside it, she remembered this from childhood, led to a storage room, a small space under the slope of the roof where her father kept things he used infrequently, spare equipment, winter gear, the items that did not have a place in the main cabin but that he had not wanted to discard. And above all of it, above the bedroom and the storage room and the main living space, was the attic. Eleanor had not thought about the attic until she saw the pull cord hanging from the ceiling in the short hallway between the bedroom and the storage room. The cord was knotted at the end in the way of pull cords that have been pulled many times and have developed a practiced knot. She looked up at the ceiling and saw the outline of the access panel, a square cut into the ceiling boards, fitted with a simple hinge door. She reached for the cord. She pulled. The panel swung down, and a folding ladder extended with the particular sound of hinges that have been oiled but not recently. She looked up into the opening. Dark. The smell of closed space coming down from it, dry and old. The smell of a place that has not been opened in a very long time. She climbed the first 2 rungs of the ladder and looked into the attic. In the dim light from the opening, she could see shapes, the outlines of things stored on the attic floor, boxes and shapes covered with cloth, the suggestion of density, of accumulation. She could not see clearly enough to make out what any of it was. She climbed back down. She went to the main room and found the flashlight she had seen on the shelf beside the wood stove, a heavy utility flashlight that turned on and produced a strong beam. She went back to the ladder. She climbed up with the flashlight. What she saw when the beam swept across the attic stopped her on the 3rd rung. The attic was full. Not in the way of haphazard accumulation, the boxes and discards and forgotten things that fill ordinary attics over ordinary decades. Full in the way of deliberate collection, the organized density of a man who had been gathering things with intention and had arranged them with care. She could see it in the layout even from the top of the ladder, the way the items were grouped, the way the covered pieces were positioned, the way the space had been organized around its contents rather than the contents simply occupying whatever space was available. She swept the flashlight beam slowly across the length of the attic. It took a long moment. The attic ran the full length of the cabin's roofline, perhaps 40 feet, and it was full from the ladder to the far end. She came back down the ladder. She stood in the hallway. Raymond was in the doorway from the main room, watching her. "The attic," she said. "There's something in the attic." He looked at her expression. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet," she said. And then, because it was true and because Raymond was the kind of person you could say true things to without having to explain them, she said, "A lot of something." She went back up. This time she climbed fully into the attic and stood on the boards, testing her weight, finding them solid. She moved the flashlight beam carefully and methodically across the space. There were shelves along both sloped walls, built into the structure of the roof, solid pine shelving that she could see had been constructed by someone who knew how to build shelves that would last. On the shelves were items she could not yet fully identify, objects of varying sizes wrapped in cloth or placed in boxes, organized with a care that was visible even in the flashlight beam. In the center of the attic floor, several larger pieces stood or lay, covered with canvas tarps that had been tied at the edges with cord. She knelt beside the nearest shelf and lifted the cloth from the nearest object. It was a fishing lure, but not the kind that hung in the tackle shops in Beaufort, the molded plastic things in their bright colors, manufactured in the thousands. This was a carved wooden lure, hand-painted, perhaps 5 inches long, shaped with the specific hydrodynamic intuition of someone who understood not just what a fish is attracted to but why. The paint on it had the quality of age, the colors slightly muted but clear, the finish intact. She turned it in her hands. On the belly of the lure, in small careful letters, a name. F. G. Glass, 1931. She set it down. She lifted the cloth from the next object on the shelf. Another lure, different, larger, painted in different colors, similarly initialed and dated. This one from 1928. She sat back on her heels and looked at the shelf. There were items on this shelf alone, covered individually, arranged in a sequence that she did not yet understand, that stretched the full length of the wall. She looked at the other shelf. More items, similarly covered. She went back to the ladder. She went down. Raymond was still in the doorway. "I need better light," she said. "And I need you to come up." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. They brought the lantern from the camping supplies in the car, the kind that produces a broad, even light, and they set it on a hook near the attic access and climbed up together and stood in the full light of it and looked at what Harold Gaines had left in the attic of his fishing cabin on Leland Lake. The lures were everywhere, not just on the shelves, though the shelves held dozens of them, each wrapped in cloth, each individually labeled in her father's handwriting on a small tag tied to the wrapping. The boxes on the attic floor contained more, nested in tissue paper, organized by what Eleanor would understand later to be by maker and era. The accumulated collection of a man who had spent 50 years seeking out the work of the hand carvers and the folk artists and the regional craftsmen who had made fishing lures in the years before industrial manufacturing had made their work obsolete and rare. Raymond was moving slowly along the shelf, lifting each cloth, looking at what was beneath, setting it back carefully. He said very little. Eleanor had learned that Raymond's silences had specific qualities, and this one had the quality of someone in the presence of something that requires full attention and resists being diminished by premature speech. She went to the larger covered shapes in the center of the attic and untied the cord on the nearest tarp and lifted it. A carved wooden fish. Not a lure, not something designed to go in the water, but a decoy, a decorative carving in the folk art tradition of the fish decoys that ice fishermen in the northern states had used for generations and that had developed their own tradition of craftsmanship, their own artists, and their own aesthetics. This one was perhaps 18 inches long, carved from what appeared to be white pine, painted with a precision and a vitality that made it look, in the lantern light, as if it might move. On its underside, carved into the wood before painting, a name and a date. Bud Hendricks, 1947. She lifted the next tarp. Another decoy, different, smaller, a different fish species, different painter, different year. She lifted tarp after tarp in the lantern light of her father's attic, and with each one the shape of what he had spent 50 years gathering became clearer and more astonishing and more entirely itself, the coherent vision of a man who had understood what he was looking at in these objects, who had understood that the folk artists and the rural craftsmen who had made fishing equipment by hand in the decades before the war had produced things of genuine beauty and genuine rarity, and who had spent his life gathering them one by one from the estate sales and the old tackle shops and the fishermen's families who did not know what they had, and who had brought them here to his attic and kept them in the dark. There was a padlock on a wooden cabinet at the far end of the attic. Eleanor had noticed it when she first swept the flashlight beam across the space, but had not yet reached it. She went to it now. The padlock was a good one, solid brass, the kind that does not yield to age or humidity. It was locked. She looked at the key ring from the lawyer's envelope. There were 3 keys on it. She had used one for the front door. The second was smaller, the kind of key that opens a padlock. She had not known what it was for. She tried it. It turned. The cabinet was full of papers. Ledgers, folders, envelopes. and at the front of the cabinet, placed where it would be found first, a sealed envelope with her name on it in her father's handwriting. Eleanor, it said. Just that. She took it down the ladder with her. She sat at the pine table in the main room in the April light coming through the window that looked out over the lake. Raymond sat across from her with the fishing manual in his hands, held with the care of someone holding something fragile and significant. She opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a second, smaller envelope, sealed separately, that bore a different kind of label. This one, in her father's handwriting again, said, Land Office, Beaufort County, Deed of Record. She read the letter first. Her father had written it 6 months before he died, in the careful, unhurried handwriting of a man who understands that what he is writing will be read after he is gone and who takes that responsibility seriously. The handwriting was slightly less certain than she remembered it, the hand of someone who has passed 80 and whose body has begun to negotiate, but the words had his quality, direct and undecorated. He wrote about the collection. He had begun gathering, he wrote, in the 1960s, when he had first understood what was happening to the handmade fishing equipment of the earlier decades, how it was being displaced, devalued, discarded, how the people who had made it were dying and their families did not know what it was worth, and the things were going to estate sales for dollars and to garbage bins for nothing. He had begun buying what he could find, carefully, within his means, over decades, never spending what he could not afford, always looking, always paying attention. He had done research. He had corresponded with the scholars who were beginning, slowly, to document the folk art tradition of handmade fishing equipment. He had kept records. The ledgers in the cabinet contained the provenance of every item in the attic, where he had found it, what he had paid for it, what the correspondence said about it, what it was. He had intended, he wrote, to tell Eleanor about the collection while he was alive. He had put it off the way people put off the conversations that matter most, not from avoidance exactly, but from the difficulty of finding the right moment for something this large. And then Douglas and the divorce had arrived, and he had watched what happened from the specific helplessness of a parent who cannot intervene without making things worse, and he had made a decision. He had decided not to tell Eleanor about the collection until it could not be reached by the proceedings. He had understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had watched the proceedings with helpless attention, that had the collection been known about, it would have been claimed, valued, divided, its pieces scattered. He had sealed the attic. He had removed the reference to the collection from any documents that the divorce lawyers might have access to. He had left it for after. He wrote, I know what Constance and Douglas and Patrice thought when the cabin was read out in the will. I was not there, but I know. I have known that family for 31 years, and I know what they think things are worth and what they cannot see. He wrote, The cabin is not the inheritance, Eleanor. The cabin is the container. He wrote, You will need to have the collection assessed properly. There are names in the ledgers, scholars and dealers who know this material, who have corresponded with me over the years. Start with the name at the top of the first ledger page. His name is Dr. James Whitfield, and he is at the American Folk Art Museum in New York, and he has known about this collection for 20 years and has been waiting, with remarkable patience, for the moment when it could be properly presented. He wrote, I am sorry I could not be there when you opened the cabinet. I would have liked to see your face. He wrote, at the end, the other envelope. Go to the county land office with it unopened and ask them to record it. It is a deed. The fishing cabin and the 2 acres it sits on are yours, but the deed in that envelope covers another parcel, the 12 acres along the eastern shore of Leland Lake that I purchased in 1987. I never filed it. I kept it here because a filed deed is a public record, and a public record can be found by lawyers. File it now. The land is yours. Do with it what seems right. Eleanor set the letter on the table. She sat for a long moment. Outside, the lake was doing what it always did, which was everything and nothing, the flat dark surface of it catching the April light, the cypress knees rising from the shallows, the wood stork that Raymond had seen earlier doing something slow and deliberate in the shallows near the far bank. Raymond had set down the fishing manual. He was watching her with the quality of attention she had come to know as his particular form of love, complete and without demand. She looked at the sealed envelope in her hand. Beaufort County, Deed of Record. She thought about Constance's laughter in the beige-carpeted room. She thought about the lawyer reading out the address of a fishing cabin on a dirt road and the sound that had followed it. She thought about Patrice saying, loudly enough to be clearly heard, that at least it would make a nice bonfire. She set the envelope on the table beside her father's letter. She looked at Raymond. "We're going to need more lanterns," she said. "We're going to need to go back up." Raymond looked at her steadily. "How much is up there?" Eleanor thought about the shelves, about the covered shapes, about the cabinet full of ledgers, and the name at the top of the first page. "A life's worth," she said. "His whole life's worth." They spent the rest of that first afternoon in the attic. Eleanor had not planned it that way. She had imagined, driving down from Beaufort that morning, that the cabin would require a certain kind of practical attention, the clearing of cobwebs and the checking of pipes, and the specific work of making a space that has been closed for years habitable again. She had imagined a methodical survey of the property, a list of what needed doing, the organized approach she brought to necessary tasks. She had not imagined standing in a lantern-lit attic at 4 in the afternoon, still lifting cloth from objects on a shelf, still finding things she had not expected, still having the specific feeling of a person who has walked into a room that is larger on the inside than it appeared from outside. Raymond had brought up a second lantern and a folding camp stool from the car, and had positioned himself near the shelves along the east wall with the methodical patience of a scientist doing field work. He worked slowly, lifting each cloth, examining what was beneath, replacing the cloth with the same care he would have used handling biological specimens in his laboratory. He said very little. Eleanor had learned in 2 years of marriage that Raymond's silences had specific qualities, and this one had the quality of someone in the presence of something that commands full attention and resists being diminished by premature speech. Eleanor had taken the ledgers from the cabinet and brought them to the camp stool and was working through the first one in the lantern light. Her father's handwriting, dense and careful, filling the ruled pages with the documentation of 50 years of deliberate gathering. Each entry had a date, a description, a location of acquisition, a price paid, and in a separate column that ran along the right margin of each page, a reference number that corresponded, she would eventually understand, to a specific item's position in the attic and to a folder in the cabinet that held the provenance research her father had accumulated on that piece. He had been thorough in the way that quiet men with long memories and patient habits are thorough, not in the showy thoroughness of someone who wants their diligence observed, but in the thorough thoroughness of someone who does it because the alternative is to leave something incomplete, and an incomplete thing is a thing that has not been done. The first entry in the first ledger was dated May 1967. A carved wooden lure, willow body, hand-painted yellow perch pattern, signed on the belly F. G. Glass, 1934. Acquired from the estate of Thomas Reese, Walterboro, South Carolina. Price paid, $2.00. Reference, folder A1. $2. Eleanor looked at the entry for a long time. She looked at the shelf where the lures were organized and thought about what they might be worth now, not because the dollar amount was the point, but because the distance between $2 in 1967 and whatever the current figure might be was the specific distance between what her father had seen and what the rest of the world had not yet learned to see. That distance was the whole story of the collection. It was the whole story of Harold Gaines, in its way. She kept reading. The entries continued through the late 60s and the 70s and the 80s, each one a small specific act of preservation, each one a thing rescued from the estate sale or the retiring fisherman's shed or the old tackle shop closing its doors, each one recorded with the same care, the same reference number, the same column of information that would allow someone who came after to know exactly what it was and where it had come from. By 1980, the entries were showing that her father had begun corresponding with scholars. The first name that appeared was a man named Colbert at the Smithsonian, who had written a paper in 1978 on the folk art tradition of handmade fishing equipment, and who had, it appeared from the ledger notations, been surprised and then genuinely excited to discover that Harold Gaines in Beaufort, South Carolina, had been collecting this material for over a decade and had assembled a body of work that Colbert had described in a letter, which was clipped to the ledger page, as one of the most significant private collections of American fishing folk art I have encountered. Eleanor read that sentence 3 times. She looked up from the ledger. Raymond was on the other side of the attic, standing before one of the covered central pieces, the large ones, the ones she had not yet reached. He had lifted the tarp. He stood looking at what was beneath it with the stillness of someone who has found something that requires a moment before words are possible. "Ellie," he said. She got up from the stool and crossed the attic to where he stood. She looked at what he had uncovered. It was a mounted fish. Not a carved decoy, not a lure, but a full mount, a largemouth bass of exceptional size, mounted on a piece of driftwood in the style of the early 20th century taxidermy. The paint applied by hand in the specific way of the folk taxidermists of that era, who understood that a mounted fish was as much a painting as a specimen. The colors were extraordinary, the greens and golds and the dark lateral stripe of the base rendered with a vitality that the passing decades had not diminished. On the back of the driftwood mount, burned into the wood with a tool, a name, Amos Reed, 1922. "Hog Bayou, L.A." Raymond said. "I know that name." Eleanor looked at him. "Amos Reed," he said. "He was documented in a paper I read years ago. A Louisiana folk taxidermist who worked in the early part of the last century. The paper said there were believed to be fewer than 20 surviving examples of his work." He looked at the mount. "This is one of them." Eleanor looked at the mount for a long time. She thought about her father finding this in some shed or estate sale in the Low Country, recognizing it for what it was, bringing it here, covering it with a tarp, writing it in the ledger in his careful handwriting. She thought about the price he had paid for it, which she would find later in the ledger, $11, from the estate of a man in Walterboro in 1974 whose family had not known what it was. She thought about Constance's laughter. She thought about the specific quality of that laughter, the assurance in it, the certainty of a woman who has always believed that she knows what things are worth and who has never been seriously challenged in that belief. She thought, "You did not know what you were laughing at." They ate dinner that evening at the pine table in the main room. The simple meal Eleanor had packed that morning in Beaufort, the food of people who have traveled and have a camp stove and are too absorbed in something else to want anything elaborate. They ate and talked about what they had found and what the ledger entries suggested and what Raymond's knowledge of the folk art market could add to what the ledger's correspondence columns indicated. Raymond had spent his career as a marine biologist but had grown up in a family with a serious interest in American folk art and had absorbed, through decades of accompanying his parents to museums and auctions, and the specific conversations of people who love and study these objects, a working knowledge of the field that was not professional but was considerably more than casual. He knew enough to know what they were looking at in general terms, which was a collection assembled over 50 years by a man with genuine connoisseurship and the patience to gather it slowly and the wisdom to keep it quiet. He did not know enough to tell Eleanor what it was worth. That would require Dr. James Whitfield at the American Folk Art Museum, whose name was at the top of the first ledger page and who had, her father had written, been waiting 20 years for this conversation. "We should call him," Raymond said. "Monday," Eleanor said. It was Friday evening. "We have the weekend." Raymond looked at her across the table. The lake was darkening outside the window, the last of the daylight going out of it. "You want to stay?" "I want to stay," she said. "I want to go back up in the morning with better light and go through all of it properly. I want to read the ledger. I want to understand what he built before I call anyone." Raymond nodded. He had the quality, which Eleanor had recognized in him early and which she considered one of the most valuable things about him, of not requiring things to move faster than they should. He was a scientist, and he understood that observation precedes conclusion and that rushing to conclusion before observation is complete produces bad science. And, she had come to understand, bad living. They slept that night in the cabin's single bedroom, in the iron bed that her father had slept in for decades, under a quilt that Eleanor recognized as her grandmother's work. She lay awake for a while after Raymond slept, listening to the lake, which made the sounds that still water makes at night, the occasional small disturbance of a fish or a bird at the surface, the settling of the cypress, the particular quiet that is not silence but the full presence of a living place after dark. She thought about her father lying in this bed in the years after her mother died, coming out here alone on weekends, waking before dawn to fish, coming back to this room at night. She thought about what it had meant to him to have this place, this private place, this place where the collection was kept, and where he was most himself. She thought about the 20 years of correspondence with scholars whose letters were in the cabinet folders, the relationship with Dr. Whitfield that had sustained itself through letters and occasional phone calls across 2 decades, the quiet ongoing conversation of 2 people who cared about the same things. She had not known this version of her father. Not because he had hidden it from her, but because she had not known how to ask. He had not known how to offer it. They had loved each other with the specific, slightly awkward love of a parent and an only child who resemble each other in temperament and therefore approach each other carefully, each one recognizing in the other the same privacy they require for themselves. She wished she had asked. She thought, I am going to know him now, through this. Through the ledgers, and the collection, and the letters. He left me what I need to know him. She thought that this was, perhaps, the largest thing he had left her. She slept. The morning was extraordinary. She had forgotten, or perhaps had never properly known, what the low country looks like at dawn from the edge of an inland lake. The light came in from the east across the flat water and lit the cypress from behind and produced a quality of illumination that had nothing to do with the ordinary management of daylight and everything to do with the specific way water and morning meet in a place that has not been overdeveloped or overlit. The wood stork was back in the shallows. Two herons stood motionless in the cypress knees on the far bank with the absolute stillness of creatures that understand patience as a survival strategy. Raymond was already on the porch with his coffee and his binoculars when Eleanor came out. She stood beside him and looked at the lake and understood why her father had come here for 50 years. Not just for the fishing. For this. They went back to the attic after breakfast and spent the full day in it, working methodically from one end to the other, lifting each cloth, reading each label, cross-referencing with the ledger. By the end of the day, Eleanor had a working inventory of what the attic contained. 214 individual pieces. Lures, decoys, mounted fish, hand-tied fly collections in their original cases, and in the far corner of the attic behind the last shelf, a discovery she had not anticipated and that stopped her completely when she reached it. Paintings. Not large paintings, not dramatic paintings, but 12 small oils and watercolors, each framed simply in the manner of the folk art tradition, each depicting a fishing scene in the specific way of the self-taught artists who had documented the fishing culture of the American South in the first half of the 20th century. River scenes, lake scenes, men in small boats in the early morning light, fish breaking the surface, the particular quality of water rendered by someone who understood it from long observation rather than from academic training. Each painting was signed. Each painting had a provenance label on the back in her father's handwriting. Eleanor sat on the attic floor in front of the 12 paintings and looked at them in the lantern light and thought about her father going to some estate sale in a town whose name she had not yet read in the ledger and seeing these on a wall somewhere and understanding what they were and bringing them here. She thought, he saw everything. She thought, he saw it all and kept quiet about it for 50 years and left it for me when I needed it most. Raymond came to where she was sitting and crouched beside her and looked at the paintings. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, your father was something. Yes, Eleanor said. He was. She called Dr. James Whitfield on Monday morning from the cabin porch with the lake behind her and the signal adequate if she stood in the right corner of the porch, which she had identified through trial and error on Saturday, when she had called Raymond's daughter in Charleston to let her know they were staying an extra few days. The number was in the ledger, written in her father's hand in the inside cover, with the notation, James Whitfield, American Folk Art Museum, New York. Call when the time is right. A man answered on the third ring. His voice was the voice of someone in his late 60s or early 70s, careful and precise. Dr. Whitfield, Eleanor said. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I'm Harold Gaines's daughter. I'm calling from Leland Lake. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Not a disconnected silence, not the silence of someone who does not know what to say, but a specific kind of silence that Eleanor would later describe to Raymond as the silence of someone who has been waiting for a phone call for a very long time and has just received it. Mrs. Marsh, Dr. Whitfield said, your father told me you would call when the time came. I have been waiting to hear from you for 20 years. Eleanor looked at the lake. A heron crossed from the far bank to the near shore in the long, slow wing beats of its kind, unhurried, entirely certain of its direction. He left me the ledgers, she said, and the collection, all of it. Another silence, this one different, the silence of someone absorbing something significant. All of it, Dr. Whitfield said. He kept it all together. He kept it all together, Eleanor said. In the attic of the cabin. 214 pieces. The paintings as well. The paintings. His voice had changed. He always said the paintings were the part he was most uncertain about. He wasn't sure they were what he thought they were, and he didn't want to get it wrong. Are they what he thought? A third silence, shorter. Mrs. Marsh, I would need to see them. But your father's I was one of the finest I have encountered in 50 years of this work. If he thought they were what he said he thought they were, then I would want to be very careful before disagreeing with him. He paused. Would you be willing to allow me to come? Yes, Eleanor said. That's why I called. He came the following Thursday, driving down from New York in his own car with a colleague, a younger woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, who specialized in the authentication of American folk art, and who had the specific quality of someone who has spent years learning to look at things very carefully and who brings that quality of looking to everything she encounters. They arrived in the early afternoon, the rental car managing the dirt road. With more confidence than Eleanor's had on the first day, and they stood in the clearing at the lake's edge and looked at the cabin and at the lake, and Dr. Whitfield said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Harold always said the location was part of the collection, that the collection belonged to this landscape. He looked at the lake, at the cypress, at the long flat light of the Thursday afternoon on the water. I understand now what he meant. They spent the rest of Thursday and all of Friday in the attic. Dr. Whitfield and Dr. Chun worked with the focused efficiency of professionals who have done this before, but who are also, clearly and unmistakably, moved by what they are seeing. They handled each piece with the careful authority of people who know exactly what they are holding and what it means. They photographed everything. They cross-referenced with the ledger. They conferred in the low voices of two people who are saying to each other the things that need to be said between themselves before anything is said to the person who is waiting. Eleanor spent those 2 days on the porch and in the main room, reading the rest of the ledger, reading the correspondence in the cabinet folders, assembling from these documents the picture of her father's 50-year engagement with this collection and with the small world of scholars and dealers and fellow collectors who had known about it. She found in the cabinet, in a folder labeled Simply Correspondence, the letters from Dr. Whitfield spanning 20 years. She read them in chronological order, starting from the first one in 2004. A formal letter of introduction from the museum requesting information about the collection, and following the exchange through 2 decades of what became, as she read, something more than professional correspondence. They had become, across 20 years of letters, something close to friends. 2 people who cared about the same things, who trusted each other's knowledge, who had in common the specific quality of taking seriously what other people overlooked. In a letter from 2019, 5 years before her father died, Dr. Whitfield had written, I want to ask you directly, Harold, what your intentions are for the collection after you are gone. I ask not to pressure you, but because I want to be of whatever use I can in ensuring that it stays together. Collections like this one are dismantled every day by estates that don't understand what they have. I would hate to see that happen here. Her father had written back, in a letter whose copy was in the folder, it will not be dismantled. I have made arrangements. My daughter will have it, whole, when the time comes. She will know what to do with it. I have raised her to know the worth of things. Eleanor sat with that letter for a long time. She thought. He knew I would know. He trusted that. She thought about the 31 years of marriage to Douglas, the years during which she had not known what her father kept in the attic above the bedroom of his fishing cabin, the years during which she had been someone else's wife in someone else's house in a life organized around Douglas's firm and Constance's dinners and the careful management of everyone else's comfort. She had been, during those years, diminished in ways she had not fully understood until the divorce revealed the shape of the diminishment, the way an illness reveals itself fully only when it is over. She had not stopped knowing the worth of things. She had simply been in circumstances that did not reward the knowing. She was in different circumstances now. On Friday evening, Dr. Whitfield and Dr. Chun came down from the attic and sat at the pine table in the main room with Eleanor and Raymond and the lake going dark outside the window. Dr. Whitfield had a notepad in front of him. Dr. Chun had her laptop. They both had the expression of people who have completed a significant piece of work and who are now required to translate what they found into language that can be communicated. Dr. Whitfield looked at Eleanor across the table. He was a man of perhaps 70, with the particular quality of someone who has spent his life looking carefully at beautiful things and who carries that careful looking in the way he regards everything. He looked at Eleanor now with the same quality, the The full attention of someone who understands that what he is about to say is significant and who wants to get it right. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "I would like to start by telling you what your father built." He told her. The carved lure collection was one of the 3 or 4 largest documented collections of American fishing folk art in private hands. The pieces from F.G. Glass alone, 17 items spanning his working years from 1921 to 1943, constituted what Dr. Whitfield described as a career retrospective of an artist whose work had become extraordinarily rare and whose documented pieces sold, when they came to auction, which was infrequently, for figures that had moved significantly upward in the past decade as the folk art market had recognized what scholars had known for 30 years. The glass pieces alone, he said carefully, would be expected to realize at auction an aggregate figure in the range of $400,000. Eleanor looked at the table. "The decoys," Dr. Whitfield continued, "are similarly significant. The Amos Reed mount your husband found on the first day is, as I believe Raymond told you, an exceptionally rare example. We are aware of 19 documented Reed pieces. This would be the 20th. The last Reed to come to auction, in 2021, sold for $87,000. The condition of this piece is superior to that example." Eleanor looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at the table with the expression of a man who is being careful to let this land at its own pace. "The paintings," Dr. Whitfield said, and here his voice changed slightly, took on a quality that Eleanor had not heard before in his. "Careful professional delivery are the part that requires me to be very precise about what I am saying and what I am not yet saying." He paused. He looked at Dr. Chun, who gave a slight nod. "There are 3 painters represented in your father's collection whose work he identified in his ledger as being, in his estimation, significant. He was uncertain, as he told me in correspondence, because these 3 artists are not yet fully documented. Their canvases are rare, and attribution in this area of American folk painting is a field that requires careful scholarship rather than immediate pronouncements." Another pause. "I am not in a position to make final attributions today. Authentication of this kind requires laboratory analysis and peer review and time. What I can tell you is that my colleague Dr. Chun and I, having looked at these 12 paintings for 2 days, believe your father's identifications to be correct. If the laboratory analysis confirms what we believe we are seeing, then the paintings alone represent a finding of considerable significance to the field of American folk art. And their value, Mrs. Marsh, would not be measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars." The lake was fully dark outside the window. Something moved in the shallows, a night bird or a fish, a small disturbance, and then quiet again. "What would it be measured in?" Eleanor asked. Dr. Whitfield looked at her steadily. "Millions," he said. "I am being deliberately imprecise because the authentication process will determine the range. But yes, millions." Eleanor sat with that word in the way she had been sitting with things for 2.5 years, not rushing toward it, letting it settle, letting it find its true weight. She thought about her father going to an estate sale in a town she had not yet found in the ledger and seeing 3 paintings on a wall and understanding what he was looking at. She thought about what it had cost him to buy them, which would have been a sum measured in tens of dollars or perhaps $100 at most, and what it had cost him to keep quiet about them for decades. She thought about the discipline of that silence, the specific self-restraint of someone who understands that what he has found will only reach its full meaning at the right moment, and who is willing to wait for that moment even if he will not be there to see it. She thought about the second envelope, the deed of record, the 12 acres along the eastern shore of Leland Lake that had not been filed. She had not told Dr. Whitfield about the deed. She had driven to the Beaufort County Land Office on Wednesday, the day before the scholars arrived, with the sealed envelope in her bag and Raymond in the passenger seat, and she had handed the envelope to the clerk at the counter and explained that she needed to record a deed, that the deed was for property in Watauga County, that it had been in her father's possession and had not been previously filed. The clerk had opened the envelope and looked at the deed and typed something into her computer and waited, and then looked up with an expression that Eleanor would later describe to Raymond as professionally neutral with effort. "Ma'am," the clerk had said, "this deed is for 12 acres of lakefront property on Leland Lake in the Eastern Shore Corridor. Are you aware that the Eastern Shore Corridor of Leland Lake was designated a protected wetland area in 2018? Eleanor had said that she had not been aware of this. The clerk had said that protected wetland designation did not affect ownership of existing parcels predating the designation, but did affect development rights in specific ways that Eleanor would want to consult with a land use attorney about. Eleanor had said that she would do that. The clerk had recorded the deed. Eleanor had been given the stamped copy. She had put it in her bag and walked out of the land office into the Beaufort morning with Raymond beside her and had stood on the sidewalk for a moment before speaking. 12 acres of protected wetland on a lake in the low country, Raymond had said. Yes, Eleanor had said. Raymond, who had spent his career studying the estuarine ecosystems of the South Carolina coast, and who understood what protected wetland designation meant in terms of the ecological and conservation value of a parcel, had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, with the careful precision of someone who is being accurate rather than dramatic, "Ellie, that land may be worth more than the cabin. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." She had thought about that since. She had thought about it sitting on the porch with her coffee in the mornings and reading the ledger in the evenings and lying awake listening to the lake. She had thought about what her father had understood when he acquired those 12 acres in 1987, what he had seen in that land that had made him buy it quietly and keep the deed private and carry the knowledge of it through the remaining decades of his life without saying a word to anyone who might have claimed it. He had seen the lake. He had seen the cypress and the shallows and the specific ecology of the eastern shore where the water was cleanest and the bird life was most concentrated and the land was most entirely itself. He had bought it because he understood what it was worth in the deepest sense, the sense that had nothing to do with the price per acre and everything to do with what would happen to it if someone who did not understand its worth got hold of it. He had kept it from the divorce proceedings not only to protect Eleanor, but to protect the land. Because if the land had been a known asset, it would have been valued, and the valuation would have produced a development assessment, and the development assessment would have gone into a mediator's formula, and whatever came out of that formula would have found its way eventually to Douglas and Constance and Patrice, who would have known exactly what to do with 12 acres of lakefront property in the South Carolina Low Country, and it would not have been what Harold Gaines would have wanted done with it. After Dr. Whitfield and Dr. Chun left on Saturday morning, after the careful goodbyes and the exchange of contact information and Dr. Whitfield's promise to initiate the authentication process from New York and to be in touch within 2 weeks, Eleanor and Raymond sat on the porch in the Saturday morning light and were quiet for a while. Raymond had his coffee. Eleanor had hers. The lake was doing what it always did in the morning, which was receiving the light and giving back something more than it received, the specific generosity of water. "What are you thinking?" Raymond asked. Eleanor looked at the lake. She thought about Dr. Whitfield's word. Millions. She thought about the 12 acres. She thought about her father's letter on the table inside. I know what they thought when the cabin was read out in the will. She thought about what she was going to do. She had not yet decided the final shape of it, the specific form that her decision would take. But she knew the direction. She had known it since she read her father's letter at the pine table on the first Friday, since she had held the sealed deed in her hands and understood that what her father had preserved was not just a collection and not just a parcel of land, but a set of possibilities, an opening into a future that he had prepared for her, because he had understood that the future she had been given by the divorce was too small. She was 68 years old. She was married to a man who understood water and patience and the worth of things that other people overlooked. She had a fishing cabin on a lake that her father had loved for 50 years and an attic full of his life's work and 12 acres of protected wetland along the eastern shore and the name of a scholar in New York who had been waiting 20 years to help her understand what she had. She thought about Constance's laughter in the beige-carpeted room. She thought about Douglas pressing his lips together. She thought about Patrice saying it would make a nice bonfire. She thought, they laughed at the container. They never thought about what it contained. "I'm thinking," she said to Raymond, "that we need to come back. Not just for a week. For longer." Raymond looked at the lake. He was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet that means he is considering something seriously rather than agreeing automatically. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "This ecosystem," he said, nodding toward the lake, the cypress, the eastern shore visible in the morning clarity. "The eastern shore corridor. I'd like to study it properly." There's been no serious survey of the estuarine ecology of the inland lake system in this part of the low country in 20 years. And if what the Land Office said about the protected designation is accurate, a proper ecological survey would be the most important thing anyone could do for that land right now. He looked at her. For its future. Eleanor understood what he was saying. An ecological survey conducted by a credentialed marine biologist on a protected wetland parcel in the South Carolina Low Country. A survey that documented the specific biological value of that land in scientific terms was the most powerful protection that 12 acres could have. More powerful than a deed. More powerful than a designation. A documented ecological value was something that could be read into a conservation easement, held in perpetuity, protected in ways that a filing in the county land office alone could not fully accomplish. Raymond had thought of this. He had thought of it and had been thinking about how to offer it without making it seem like anything other than what it was, which was a husband seeing what his wife needed and knowing how to help. She reached over and put her hand on his. They sat for a long time on the porch of her father's fishing cabin with the lake before them and the decision taking shape in the way that good decisions take shape. Not suddenly, not with drama, but with the slow clarity of something that was always going to be this way and is only now becoming visible. Inside the cabin, in the ledger on the pine table, her father's handwriting ran down page after page in its careful columns. Outside, the lake held the morning light with its particular patience. The wood stork had returned to its station in the shallows. The eastern shore was green and still across the water. Everything her father had built was here. Everything he had saved. Everything he had kept quiet about for 50 years. Waiting for the moment when it could be most useful. Waiting for the moment when the person he had saved it for was ready to receive it. She was ready. The authentication results came 6 weeks later in a letter from Dr. Whitfield that Eleanor read on the cabin porch with the lake before her and Raymond beside her and the wood stork in its usual place in the shallows as if it had agreed to be present for significant moments. The paintings were what her father had believed them to be. 3 confirmed works by artists whose canvases had not been seen on the market in decades. The laboratory analysis had been unambiguous. The peer review had concurred. Dr. Whitfield wrote with the restrained excitement of a scholar who has spent 50 years waiting to say something and is now finally permitted to say it. The collection, he wrote, in its entirety, represents the most significant body of American fishing folk art to come to light in the last 30 years. The paintings alone carry a conservative auction estimate of $2.4 million. Eleanor set the letter on the porch railing. She did not cry. She sat. For a long time in the specific stillness of someone who has received news large enough to require patience before it can be fully inhabited. She thought about her father at an estate sale in Walterboro in 1974, paying $11 for an Amos Reed mount. She thought about 50 years of quiet seeing. She thought about the attic sealed above the bedroom where he had slept alone after her mother died, the whole of it kept in the dark, waiting. She thought about Constance's laughter. The karma moment arranged itself, the way things do when they have their own logic and simply require time. Patrice was a real estate agent. Real estate agents read the public records. The deed filing for 12 acres of protected lakefront wetland on Leland Lake appeared in the county records 2 weeks after Eleanor filed it. Patrice found it. She called Douglas. Douglas called his lawyer. The lawyer told him what protected wetland designation meant, what the filing date meant in relation to the finalized divorce settlement. It meant there was nothing to be done. The deed had been her father's, passed to Eleanor through the will, never disclosed because no one had known to look for it. Eleanor received no call from Douglas, no call from Constance, no call from Patrice. She had not expected one. The collection went to auction the following spring. It realized $3.1 million. Eleanor kept 4 pieces. The F.G. glass lure from 1934, first entry in the first ledger. The Amos Reed mount. 1 painting, the river scene in early morning light, which she hung above the wood stove where her father's eyes would have found it every morning. And the 1947 fishing manual, which she gave to Raymond on their 2nd anniversary, wrapped in the same cloth her father had used for the lures. Raymond held it without speaking. Then he said, quietly, that Harold Gaines must have been someone worth knowing. Eleanor said yes. She was only now beginning to understand how much. Raymond's ecological survey of the Eastern Shore prompted the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources to request a permanent conservation easement on the 12 acres. Eleanor signed it on a Thursday morning in Beaufort with her grandmother's pen. The land would remain what it was. The cypress and the shallows and the wood stork in its station and the particular quality of low country light on inland water. Protected. Whole. Forever. She drove back to Leland Lake that afternoon and sat on the porch until the light was gone. Raymond brought coffee and sat beside her, and they were quiet together in the way of people who have built something real and do not need to narrate it. She thought about what her father had written. The cabin is not the inheritance. The cabin is the container. She understood now. What the container held was not money or property or auction figures. It was proof that he had known who she was, that he had seen her, the real her, the one who knew the worth of things, the one who had survived 31 years of being told she did not. He had built something for her and trusted she would come when she was ready. She had come. She had understood. She knew what to do. The door her father had locked was open now. It would not be locked again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.